we proceed and we say that, as I've been saying, really your deliberations will be an invaluable input, invaluable in contributing towards finalization of the first 10-year plan of Africa Structural Framework, which has now been adopted by all member states of the African Union, and that is the Agenda 2063. Indeed, at this turning point when the world is preparing for a new global development agenda by way of post-2015 development agenda and its sustainable development goals, African countries are committed to implementing structural transformation of their own economies according to their own designs, adhering to their own set priorities to realize the aspirations of their citizenry. This will be within the context of Agenda 2063. In short, post-2015 development agenda will be a subset of Agenda 2063 in as far as Africa is concerned. Africa will integrate or domesticate Agenda 2063 into their national and regional strategic and action plans, as well as in their development programs. You will agree, Excellencies, that this Agenda 2063 is not the first African development framework aiming at realizing Africa's development. This differs from previous ones in that it is based on a broad spectrum of consultations with African stakeholders. It is based on existing frameworks, continental programs, resolutions and declarations, constitutive instruments, and analysis of national and regional strategic frameworks. So this inclusive approach has ensured ownership and should have generated high commitment and stronger resolve to implement. It is to be accompanied by an effective monitoring and evaluation mechanism to ensure accountability. Communication strategy will keep it alive in the minds of the stakeholders. Requisite capacity to implement it is being duly addressed already. Clearly, implementing Agenda 2063 will not amount to being business as usual or more of the same. Africa has turned a new leaf. Pragmatism through this framework is prevailing and is immense indeed. Chances of success are much higher. I am, for one, very hopeful of its success. Collective action will be required to overcome hurdles encountered in the implementation of the previous strategic frameworks. This will be in the form of proper strategic and action planning, as well as programming at national, regional, and continental levels, mobilizing all stakeholders and putting in place sustainable financing mechanisms. We would like you to discuss all these issues under the broad theme of implementing Agenda 2063, planning, mobilizing, and financing for development. Focusing on the first 10-year implementation plan of the agenda and its domestication at national and regional levels, as well as its financing. Indeed, non-governmental stakeholders, African stakeholders, such as the private sector and civil society organizations, are also expected to domesticate Agenda 2063 into their plans and activities, since they actively participated in its formulation. They made substantive inputs during consultations that were held for its formulation. Recognition and acceptance of the fact that Africa cannot successfully implement Agenda 2063 without adequate and dependable financing should be the driving force behind participants' discussions for the next 3 days. Of equal importance is the recognition that for development objectives and goals to be realized, they must be endorsed and implemented at the national and local government levels. It is for this reason that the first 10-year plan is calling for the domestication of Agenda 2063 at the national and regional levels. Another challenge that may risk the implementation of Agenda 2063, relates to the lack of capacity. And as planners among you, you are better placed to articulate those capacity constraints. This matter is being fully addressed. Requisite capacity has to and will be built. Discussions on the implementation of Agenda 2063 come at a time when the world is frantically preparing for the third international conference on financing for development, the successor to Monterrey and Doha, which is to be hosted by the federal government of Ethiopia, right here in Addis Ababa from July 13th to July 16th. So make sure that you make your bookings now and make sure that you are here to reinforce Africa's voice. So this international conference will be discussing the issue of financing the post-2015 development agenda and its SDGs, which will be concluded in June and blessed by the summit in September, presuming New York later this year, and other development endeavors as well, as the expiry of the Millennium Development Goals draws near. Your Excellencies, may I invite and in fact urge you to strongly ensure that we effectively and wisely utilize this opportunity to prepare adequately so that Africa's voice can be heard, can be heeded, can be appreciated, and embraced in April when there is work on the second draft, in June when there is work on the third draft, and in July during the summit. Africa needs considerable financial resources to realize its socio-economic transformational agenda, namely in the following areas, among others. It's not exhaustive: infrastructure, science and technology and innovation-based industrialization, and processing of local resources. That we are talking value addition here, agriculture, food security, and environmental sustainability, intra-Africa trade, regional and continental integration. On the social arena can be mentioned access to health care and nutrition, pertinent and quality education and training attainment, especially in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics-based education, which we have tended to underrate historically. Research and establishment of centers of excellence in education and training. If we do all these plus other things that we have to do, this should result in inclusive, job-creating, and sustained growth with equitable distribution of income and wealth, including expeditious and resolute implementation of women empowerment, youth engagement in economic activity, and I may add, inclusion of people living with disability. This way, all human resources and talents at our disposal will be put to productive use, and Africa will be well on its way to eradicating poverty. Although financing of Agenda 2063 is to be first and foremost addressed through mobilization of domestic resources, international finance would still be required. International trade will have to be appropriately reformed, and modalities to keep Africa's debt at sustainable levels should be identified and applied. Promotion of technology development, transfer and diffusion, and innovation, as well as capacity building, will need to be intensified. These are but some of the key issues that must be discussed and consensus built around them. Besides financing and capacity challenges, Africa needs to rely on adequate, accurate, and timely statistics in order to realistically plan, monitor, evaluate its structural transformation programs. It has long been recognized that without adequate, punctual, and reliable statistics, it is difficult to track progress. Statistical field needs more attention. This should be manifested in the allocation of additional resources for the improvement of statistical systems in Africa. There have been some interventions at the level of the African Union, including the adoption of the African Charter on Statistics and the Strategy for the Harmonization of Statistics in Africa, which provide a legal framework for the coordination and production of harmonized statistics in Africa. The inclusion of an agenda item on data revolution represents one of the interventions by the Commission in collaboration with UNECA and the African Development Bank. It is my sincere wish that this issue is given due consideration to ensure that we produce quality statistics to enable us to track and monitor our development as the continent. This monitoring process also includes the assessment of progress made so far in integrating the continent. At the end of the joint African Union, UNECA, March 2014 Conference of Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, a resolution was passed or adopted supporting the index and urging governments to cooperate on the project. Your Excellencies, I'm pleased to report to you that the African Union Commission, African Development Bank, and United Nations Economic Commission for Africa are collaborating on the development of this index, which is aimed at tracking progress in Africa's regional integration and compare progress across countries. In this regard, I am also pleased to inform you that already statisticians from the member countries from COMESA, East African Community, SADC, and IGAD region have been trained on the data collection and computation of the African Regional Integration Index. In addition, this work will also look at the performance in regional integration of all 8 regional economic communities that have been recognized by the African Union. The ultimate objective of this is to better accelerate continental integration in order to enable Africa to catch up and keep abreast in participating in this dynamic and modern world as a solidly constructed or solid group. Some progress has been made, but we need to be more decisive in the rationalization and harmonization of our regional economic communities. The constant challenges arising from overlapping and multiple memberships cannot go on forever if we are to become both competitive and remain relevant in today's global world. In this connection, allow me, Your Excellencies, at this juncture, to applaud our leaders for the establishment of the COMESA, EAC, SADC, Free Trade Area tripartite in 2008, which I am highly confident we all consider to be exemplary and form an important milestone in the integration process on this continent. As you may agree with me, this landmark decision has created a single free trade area embracing 26 countries. In this endeavor, the African Union Commission is planning to hold consultations with other regional economic communities in other regions in order to encourage them to emulate these exemplary initiatives of the three regional economic communities just mentioned. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to take this opportunity to really publicly thank the hardworking and dedicated staff of the African Union Commission and of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. It is as a result of their tireless efforts that we have the documents to be discussed at this meeting and the excellent organization and coordination of this meeting. Let me also thank and commend the ECA for availing us these excellent facilities for our use. Let us also applaud the work of those who have been brainstorming in the last 2 days on elements that could be incorporated into the formation of Africa's common position on funding, having considered various contributions on the subject, including, among others, the zero draft from negotiations in New York, contribution by the African group in New York at the UN headquarters, by the African Union Commission and by UNICA, as well as by the host authorities here, the Ethiopian authorities, and others. All that was considered to distill what could form African and will be an input to this meeting. So their work should really form a basis for your deliberations, among others, and those of the later on in the week central bank governance, and eventually those of the ministers in the coming days, Monday and Tuesday. So it will be cascading down and being refined as we go down. Finally, I wish to thank you once again, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, for really having made the effort to attend this 8th joint annual meeting of the African Union Specialized Technical Committee on Finance, Monetary Affairs, Economic Planning and Integration, as well as the ECA Conference of Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. I eagerly look forward to your fruitful and successful deliberations as an input into the ministers' meeting next week. I thank you for your patience, for listening to me, and I wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And good morning again. And sorry for all these interruptions. And I think it's in the nature of our maybe struggle towards making this continent a better place. We have to go through all these processes. But I can assure you, we will get there. Mr. Bo Sid Ahmed, Vice Chair of the outgoing Bureau of the Committee of Experts, Dr. Maruping, Commissioner, African Union, Economic Affairs, Dr. Abraham Texti, State Minister of Finance and Economic Development, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Excellencies, Head of Missions, Ambassadors, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor and a great pleasure to welcome you all to Addis Ababa, Africa's rapidly transforming yet always hospitable diplomatic capital. For the 8th joint annual meeting of the AU Specialized Technical Committee on Finance, Monetary Affairs, Economic Planning and Integration, and the ECA Conference of African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. Addis Ababa's experience mirrors the positive changes occurring in many other parts and cities of our continent, which is a concrete evidence that our continent is indeed on the rise. All of us gathered here today should be genuinely proud of the progress that our continent has continued to make, particularly during the last 2 decades. We should, however, also remain conscious of the diverse challenges that still need to be overcome to make this progress more sustainable and irreversible. Sustaining and improving upon Africa's current development momentum require that various stakeholders in the continent's development continue to strategize. Looking around this whole, and it is with some real sense of pride that I note once again this event has pulled together some of Africa's finest minds and brains on development issues. Your presence here is a testimony to the importance that you all attach to the economic development of our continent. I am therefore confident that we would be able to put our minds together and leverage this important platform to provide direction and guidance for the continent's strategic development priorities for onward transmission to our ministers at the ministerial segment for consideration. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, permit me to place Africa on the rise in context. It is now common knowledge that our continent has enjoyed consistent and remarkable economic growth rates for nearly 2 decades. This has earned it the enviable classification as one of the world's fastest growing regions. The sources of this growth have included improved macroeconomic management and prudential financial policies, rising domestic demand, partly driven by a growing middle class and rapid urbanization, as well as a growing demand for our continent's commodities and natural resources, particularly from emerging economies. Notwithstanding recent unfavorable regional and global developments such as the outbreak of the Ebola virus in some of our West African countries, but also the contraction in the economies of emerging markets, maybe particularly China. However, the scales are still tipped in favor of a continuation of Africa's good economic performance in the medium term, as well as the maintenance of its global ranking as the second fastest growing region for some time to come. Despite the continent's commendable economic performance, we all know that this growth has been largely jobless and non-inclusive in nature. As a matter of fact, in some African countries, economies, growth has been accompanied to a large degree by higher rates of inequality. For example, Africa's massive infrastructure gap has continued to increase transaction costs across every sector and constrains the competitiveness of the region. Moreover, the continent has remained trapped in low value addition activities, which have tended to hamstring our effort towards greater integration in the region and globally, and particularly tapping into global value chains and also continue to prevent it from driving any meaningful benefits from its huge natural resource endowment. Furthermore, Africa currently represents only 1.8% of the world value added in manufactures, and the bulk of its export to the rest of the world are made of probably up to 60% of oil. These realities do not constitute sustainable pathways to achieving the continent's ambitions for prosperity for all. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, economic transformation and industrialization has been identified as an imperative and as the surest pathway to inclusive prosperity on the African continent. However, we are all aware that industrialization and economic transformation will not be miraculously delivered by the invisible hand of the markets. Rather, it is necessary a product of deliberate and proper long-term visioning, planning, and strategizing. It's against this background that a new long-term vision and development plan, Agenda 2063, has been developed through consultative process among African people, Pan-African institutions, and the leadership of the continent. As you are well aware, this new continental development plan was formally adopted by the head of state and government at the recently concluded 24th ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union in February this year. Adoption of Agenda 2063 comes in the backdrop of a long list of earlier long-term continent-wide development plans, including the 1980 Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja Treaty of 1991, and the New Partnerships for Africa's Development, NEPAD, in 2001. Aside from these continent-wide development plans, African countries have, over the years, also individually experimented with various types of national plans and even long-term national visions. Unfortunately, however, the results of long-term planning and visioning at both the national and continental levels have been very mixed indeed. Development planning and visioning on the continent has always faltered at the level of implementation. Partly, I would like to believe because of the lack of proper implementation plans, maybe also lack of buy-in by relevant stakeholders, as well as the inadequacy of financial resources. In adopting Agenda 2063, African leaders have been fully conscious of the challenges of its implementation that have plagued earlier initiatives, and have accordingly recommended that all relevant stakeholders work towards its successful implementation. It is therefore within the context of the efforts to enhance the implementation of Agenda 2063, the AU and the ECA have chosen the theme of this meeting as implementing Agenda 2063, planning, mobilizing, and financing for development. The theme of our conference would allow us to have a frank and honest dialogue that would enable us to come up with concrete and actionable proposals to our ministers on how to enhance development planning both at the national and regional levels, how to mobilize various stakeholders behind Agenda 2063, and more importantly, how to garner the necessary financial and human resources for the implementation of various aspects of the Agenda 2063. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, in recognition of the need to revive and strengthen development planning on the continent, ECA has in the past 2 years dedicated a good portion of its program activities to providing planning and forecasting support to member states. Similarly, in the area of statistics, have been working towards strengthening our capability to generate reliable and credible statistics, which is critical for the proper long-term planning as well as addressing the African narrative. If you don't know your narrative or your statistics, I think you cannot tell your own stories. as it goes. In the same vein, ECA has worked tirelessly with other partners, institutions, to produce, let me give as an example, a number of NDCs and indexes, the African Regional Integration Index and the Social Development Index, which are intended to assess, for the regional index, the pace of regional integration, which has long been identified as a prerequisite for Africa's economic development and global competitiveness. I would want also to note that ECA has also revamped its ability to provide capacity development services to member states and regional and sub-regional institutions, including on the improvement of capacity of member states to negotiate better contracts in the development of African minerals and other natural resources, and also address social development challenges. In the critical area of identifying and mobilizing financial resources to underwrite Africa's ambitious economic transformation agenda, the 9th Development Forum, African Development Forum, ADF, organized by the ECA with its strategic Pan-African partners, was on the theme Innovative Financing for Africa's Economic Transformation. The forum examined 5 thematic areas of development financing for Africa, namely domestic resource mobilization, illicit financial flows, private equity, climate financing, and new forms of partnerships. It produced the Marrakesh Consensus Statement, and the papers that were presented at the forum have just been reworked and published in the form of a book, and I'm sure you can have a copy of this book before you leave Addis. Another major ECA-led work worthy of mentioning here is the study on the illicit financial flows from the continent, which was undertaken as a result of a decision of the very ministers of finance, planning and economic development to conduct that study. It was led by His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, former president of South Africa, who led a very highly distinguished high-level panel. The final report of the panel was submitted to the AU Summit in February this year. One of the key findings of the study is that Africa loses colossal amount of financial resources annually through various illicit channels and practices. I'm sure you are aware and well know that magic figure of the 50 billion US dollars that the continent, in a very conservative estimates, loses every year. And that the whole in this financial hemorrhage of the continent would release huge resources that could be redirected to the continent transformation, including financing the implementation of key elements of Agenda 2063. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, my intervention will be incomplete, rather, if I fail to make reference to the exciting forthcoming 3rd International Conference on Financing for Development, which Africa had been given the honor to host right here in Addis Ababa in July of this year. As you would imagine, concerns over financial resources to implementation is not an inclusive African problem. Rather, it is a global, and that explains why the global system places so much emphasis on clearly articulating the means of implementation of the evolving post-2015 development agenda. As you are well aware, unlike during the periods of the preparation of the Millennium Development Goal, where Africa was left out or left behind, the continent has been very proactive and has fully engaged in the preparation of the post-2015 development agenda, resulting in the adoption of the Common African Position, CAP, which is in every sense aligned to the Agenda 2063. The hosting of the 3rd International Conference on Financing for Development by Africa is indeed a historic moment for the continent. I think just yesterday we have concluded this multi-stakeholder consultation on financing for development, which I would like to believe produced a very good draft document that could be considered by yourselves onwards to the ministers. The conference presents the continent with a singular opportunity to strategically leverage its status as a host to ensure that its interests and needs as embedded in the Agenda 2063 are properly captured in the declaration that would emerge from the conference and which would constitute a critical part of the post-2015 development agenda. Chairperson, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, in the coming days, we hope to engage in a very fruitful discussions on the best ways to ensure the effective implementation of Agenda 2063. Our expectations are that we would be able to come up with actionable recommendations on a number of issues that are deemed indispensable to this satisfactory implementation of Agenda 2063 and the fulfillment of our aspirations for our countries. I hope that the conference will yield concrete proposals on how to incorporate the first 10 years plan of Agenda 2063 into national and regional frameworks. I also hope that the conference will highlight specific strategies for financing Agenda 2063 through its related flagships, projects, and other strategic initiatives. Finally, expectations encompass your recommendations on mobilization strategies and how to establish Agenda 2063 partnerships and compacts. Let us work together collectively to contribute to its successful implementation. I thank you for your kind attention. Thanks.
His Excellency Dr. Mariupi, Commissioner for Economic Affairs of the AUC, His Excellency Dr. Hamdok, Deputy Executive Secretary of UNECA, Chairperson of the Bureau, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the government of Ethiopia and the people of Ethiopia to this very important meeting. I would like to wish you an enjoyable time during the course of your stay, and I urge you to make time for finest tourist attractions, foods, and experience the Ethiopian hospitality. I would also like to congratulate the facilitators, the African Union, and UNECA for a continued tradition of organizing these wonderful gatherings with the conviction to reflect on and implement important continental matters in a timely manner. Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our gathering here today is a very special one, as we are at the verge of closing one chapter of global collaboration and partnership under the United Nations and opening another era with a renewed commitment for global partnership for sustainable development. Agenda 2063, which was adopted by the heads of state and government during the January 2015 ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union here in Addis, sets a new vision for our continent. The successful implementation of this agenda has some priority implications, notably in the areas of development planning, citizen mobilization, and financing for development, which require specific actions to be taken. It is with this understanding that the organizers of the conference selected the theme implementing Agenda 2063, planning, mobilizing, and financing for development. The financing needs of Agenda 2063 are considerable, particularly with regard to regional integration, intra-Africa trade, and infrastructure. There is recognition within Africa that the continent needs to tap into its own wells to finance, There is recognition within Africa that the continent needs to tap into its own wells to finance its development agendas, notably Agenda 2063. Ladies and gentlemen, securing finance to implement the continent's development agenda is one of the big challenges ahead of us. Nonetheless, Africa needs not only funds, but also a more effective and inclusive means of channeling funds where they can be most effective and where markets are currently failing to reach. Domestic resource mobilization is the viable option we have at our disposal. There is significant untapped resource that could be raised from within Africa, enough to cover a significant proportion of our development financing needs. A comprehensive resource mobilization strategy driven by investments is needed in focus areas such as skills development, rapid economic growth, transformation, or infrastructure connectivity. This strategy will form the basis for developing and implementing financing plans at the national, regional, and continental levels. Yet, it is clear that we need to furnish the ground for the efficient mobilization and utilization of domestic resources. The solution requires integrated policy framework that changes existing patterns and sets a clear vision to mobilize and effectively utilize diverse sources of finance. Recent data confirms the success of many indigenous African growth and development initiatives through domestic finances. Currently, the largest share of Africa's infrastructure funding comes from national governments. Ladies and gentlemen, Agenda 2063 will be implemented at the continental, regional, and national and subnational levels. It must be reflected in regional and national planning frameworks. National planning frameworks such as long-term visions and national growth and development plans need to incorporate and reflect the aspirations and goals of Agenda 2063. This agenda is the collective vision of all of Africa's stakeholders. Engaging the public and private sector with clear delineation of the incentives for Africans is pivotal for the success of the agenda. Successful implementation requires the continuous mobilization and ownership of the agenda on the part of African stakeholders, including youth and women, through effective communication and outreach, and sustained and inclusive social dialogue. It is a call to action to all Africans to take personal responsibility for the destiny of the continent and to see themselves as the prime agents of change and transformation. We need to ensure also that the domestic environment is enabling for active participation and contribution of the African diaspora, both financially and expertise-wise. Our actions must respect and align to the global sustainable development principles. Respect to human rights, inclusiveness, and countering negative global climate change. Our financing strategies must be consistent with Africa's structural transformation agenda. There should be no trade-offs between our goals to mobilize resources and our principal sustainable development agenda. We should not neglect opportunities at the global market as well as our international traditional development partners. We need to tap into international resources, world trade, capital systems, and to strengthen global economic governance and continue to voice our needs and desires and call upon the international community to support African initiatives taking into account the specific needs of our continent. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we, those gathered here, are responsible for enabling all Africans through a clear set of objectives and visions and setting a convivial macroeconomic and political environment to contribute their dues and own this process. We shall oblige ourselves to working closely with our counterparts, relevant line ministries in our countries, to forge an integrated approach to our sustainable development agenda. Our deliberations in this gathering will set the ground for not only Agenda 2063, but for taking on our agenda further to the global arena in July's Financing for Development Summit in Addis Ababa. And I join the previous two speakers in reminding you to book the dates for the conference, as we are expecting Africa's voice to be heard loud and clear in the conference, and we are expecting Africa needs to be properly considered in the outcome document of the conference. During our deliberations, we should emphasize a need to provide a basket of policy options that will strengthen the environment to allow countries to integrate national development plans and financing strategies with regional and continental agendas. We should also note the relevance of channeling initial investments towards setting the policy and infrastructure environment and capacity development essential for mobilization of sustained domestic finances, such as strengthening the tax system, encouraging economic growth, industrialization, structural economic transformation, infrastructure development, good governance, and fighting corruption and rent-seeking. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to reiterate the Ethiopian government's continuous support to this initiative and that it is at the full disposal of the continent for the achievement of Agenda 2063. I wish you a fruitful deliberation and thank you very much.